Hello and welcome to the third review of Request Month 2017. Today we're taking a look at Shadow Warrior 2, first for PC back in October, and eventually it's going to be coming out on Xbox One and PlayStation 4 as well. And this particular review is coming to you courtesy of GGG Man Lives, so thank you for sending me a copy of this to take a look at. This is a first-person shooter developed by Flying Wild Hog and published by Devolver Digital in October of last year for PC, and it's eventually coming to Xbox One and PlayStation 4, although they haven't really nailed down an exact date for that yet. Regardless, it is also the sequel to 2013's reboot of the Shadow Warrior series, and it takes place about 5 years or so after the events of the previous Shadow Warrior game. It has barely anything to do with the original Shadow Warrior, so just keep that in mind as you go into this. If you've played the original Shadow Warrior but you have not played the reboot, then this is going to feel completely unfamiliar to you. Now that said, even though the reboot of Shadow Warrior really wasn't all that much like the original Shadow Warrior, it was still a really fun game at its core, and it had a lot going for it. In fact, it ended up surprising the hell out of me when I played it, because I really wasn't expecting to enjoy it as much as I ended up enjoying it. And then the sequel happened. Did they manage to get another hit on their hands, or did something else happen entirely? Let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, it's actually rather impressive. There is a fully featured options menu for the PC version, and it contains pretty much everything you would want to see in a PC game. Tons of graphics options, FOV slider, the works really. And what you end up with is an extremely well optimized game as well. I was running this thing maxed at 1080p, and I never really had many drops below 60 frames a second. If it did drop below it, usually a lot of stuff was happening on screen at once, and it was just kind of hard for the game to keep up with it. Even then, it rarely went below about 40 FPS, so it's still very much playable even when you're running into FPS drops. And keep in mind, I'm not running the latest hardware here. I'm still running a high-end rig, of course, but it's not the highest-end hardware out there, so if you're running a better rig than mine, you're probably going to get better performance. And it's definitely worth it to crank up those visuals as high as they'll go, because the environment art in this thing in particular is downright gorgeous at times. I mean, just look at the backgrounds here. They're just absolutely packed with detail. The texture quality is very good for the most part, although there are a few things here and there that are a bit messy. The shader effects and particle effects are really nice, but there are a couple of pretty major problems with the visuals. The first of them is that the weapon models are absolutely gigantic on the screen. I'm sure you've been noticing this throughout the video, but they take up a good maybe fourth of the screen, and it actually makes it kinda hard to see what you're doing when you're getting into the midst of pretty heated combat. The second thing you'll notice is that it's also hard to see what you're doing because there's constant particle effects showing up whenever you blast something. Those really nice particle effects that I mentioned also end up being something of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they look fantastic. On the other hand, well, it just gets in the way of what you're doing. It's really hard to see what you're doing in a lot of the really heated gunfights because you're just blasting enemies and you're seeing particles flying everywhere, and it's making it really hard to see. So as satisfying as it is when you blast an enemy with a shotgun and he goes flying and you see blood and guts spewing everywhere, because this game does have a really nice gore system in it as well, it's also a really big pain in the ass when you're trying to actually maneuver and get some precision shots in, and you end up sitting there going, wait a minute, what the hell is going on? I can't see. And it's a real shame that you'll get caught up on that, because the game does have a lot of really nice visual touches, like multiple reload and shooting animations that are all extremely smooth and fluid, really nice character animations with the exception of lip sync, because lip sync in this game is downright horrible. And even a few extra animations for when your gun is full but you just want to hit the reload button anyway and you end up twirling it around on your fingers or something like that. And then you go over to sound design and things are generally rather good there as well. The soundtrack is a lot of really nice hard rock mixed in with a bit of electronic stuff here and there, as well as some nice Asian influences, and it really does sound excellent. With the exception of a couple of characters, the voice acting is also very well done. They managed to get the comedic timings down pretty well, although some of the lines are kind of cringy, but that's beside the point. And even the sound effects are generally pretty well done. They're not quite as well done as the other fields, but generally speaking, the weapons do sound pretty beefy. They have some nice punch to them, and while they are a bit lacking in bass in some respects, they're still just punchy enough to where it's not really a problem. So definitely kudos to Flying Wild Hog for really doing a very good job on the presentation. But of course what really matter here are story and gameplay, and the story in this is that you play once again as Lo Wang, the self-proclaimed ninja badass who is pretty much just a gun for hire at this point in a post-collision world. What's the collision, you may well be asking? Well, that would be spoilers for the previous Shadow Warrior game, so I'm not really going to go too much into detail, but basically worlds are colliding, the demon world is trying to fuse with the human world, and it's caused all kinds of chaos and madness. The thing is, you don't really need to know the story of the previous Shadow Warrior game in order to be able to get the story here, because it pretty much explains to you everything you need to know in the first moments of the game. You see, toward the beginning of the game, something goes horribly wrong with a woman named Kamiko who is working for Zilla, and if you're familiar with the Shadow Warrior series, you know that Zilla is one of the antagonists. And the short version is that you end up rescuing Kamiko and bringing her back to Master Smith, who ends up implanting her soul in your body for safekeeping, while they try to figure out a way to undo the damage that has been done to her body. And along the way, things become more complicated as Lo Wang has to deal with all the demons and the various mob bosses and such like that, who are basically ordering him around to do various things. And while I don't really want to spoil much of the plot, suffice to say it ends up being rather disjointed in no small part due to the rather odd mission structure that this has compared to the previous Shadow Warrior game. You see, unlike the original Shadow Warrior and, of course, the reboot, this is not a linear first-person shooter. It's a semi-open world first-person shooter. What this basically means is that you have a hub that you can go to, and that's where you can do all your crafting and buying weapons and items and things like that, and you also have the various levels that you can access by teleporting to them. You get access to these levels by accepting missions from various characters throughout the course of the game, and you end up going into these various locations and finding that they're all pretty much just procedurally generated. There are definitely certain aspects of the levels that are not procedurally generated, but there are very large swaths of the game that are. And while the story missions definitely have some degree of structure to them, the side missions have basically nothing to do with anything that's going on. They're pretty much all just fetch quests or go to location and wipe out all enemies in location. And they have absolutely no bearing on the plot whatsoever. You're playing them purely for gameplay reasons, which I'll get to more in a moment. This leaves you with just the story missions, which of course do have cutscenes to kind of string things along. The problem is that there are rather large swaths of the game that feel like pointless busy work, where you'll go on to a particular story mission and it'll string you along, you'll have a cutscene at the end, and basically all you've done there is just go through the level and slaughter a bunch of enemies and haven't really advanced the plot at all. There are actually several levels where it's like this, where you just go on the level and you complete it and you come back to the quest giver only to find that you basically accomplished nothing. This means that the story just meanders along until you get toward the end of the game when things start to heat up a lot more and it finally decides that it needs to go into actually wrapping up the plot, but unfortunately the way it wraps up the plot ends up being just kind of a mess. And when you finally hit the ending of the game, you go, wait a minute, that's it? That's all you got? The plot itself just ends up falling flat on its face, and the only thing that really keeps you going for any real degree of time is the characters. And that's mostly because it is somewhat amusing to hear Kamiko and Lo Wang constantly arguing throughout the course of the game. Lo Wang is of course crass as ever, he's constantly making very crude jokes, and most of them end up falling completely flat on their face. And Kamiko basically ends up spending most of the game just complaining about how much of a moron he is and how much he pisses her off, although you do have some decent character moments here and there. It's just not enough to salvage the writing, because the writing in general is fairly weak. The vast majority of the humor just ends up falling flat on its face, and the plot itself is a rather weak plot in general. And with things being so limited on the character front, there's just nothing really to keep you going in the writing department. This means that it ultimately falls to the gameplay to bring things up. And what you have there is a game that is completely at odds with its own design. You see, the core gameplay mechanics are pretty much the same from the previous Shadow Warrior game. You have a dodge mechanic where you just kind of dash around and you're constantly trying to avoid getting hit, while also trying to dish out the pain with a variety of surprisingly cool weapons. You have a variety of chi powers that you can use, things like the Grip of Darkness, which spears enemies with these tendrils from the ground, and while it doesn't do any damage to them, it holds them in place for a certain period of time. Or you can use a Chi Blast, where you can heal yourself with Chi. There are also various special moves that you can do with your melee weapons, things like being able to conduct energy into your blade and then launch forth a wave of energy that does damage to opponents, or do a particularly powerful forward attack, or do a spinning attack that will hit all the enemies in a certain radius around you. And the thing is that in the previous Shadow Warrior game, when everything was firing on all cylinders, that was an absolute blast. Unfortunately, they completely ruined it in Shadow Warrior 2 because they made it a looter shooter. Now you have basically all of the abilities that you had in the previous Shadow Warrior game with some new traversal mechanics where you can do some double jumping around the map and climb up things and such like that, being smashed together with a loot system that consists of basically a bunch of gems. These gems gives you a bunch of passive bonuses when you slot them. You may think it would be a great opportunity to give you some really cool status effects or to give you some cool abilities, but no. All of them but one type are passive bonuses. The type that are not passive bonuses are the ones that give you different fire modes. Things like being able to remotely detonate grenades when you launch them, or being able to switch over to a rapid fire mode, or being able to fire multiple barrels at once. Most of which all come with rather hefty downsides, like, for example, if you use the dual-wielding one, then you get a massive increase to your miss rate, but you get some extra damage and ammo capacity and things like that. In fact, even though that's something that occurs with all of the ones that just give you various fire modes, in the case of the ones that are just stat bonuses, they actually end up giving you pretty hefty downsides in the higher tiers as well. So you may have one that increases the amount of damage you can do, but it also increases the amount of elemental resistance that the enemy has. Which of course begs the question, why in the living hell would you use one that does that when you can use one that's slightly lower tier, has the same exact effects, and it doesn't have the downside? Because you'll find that the blue gems tend to actually do that, where they'll have all of the same bonuses of the higher tier gems, but they just won't have any of the downsides. And you may be thinking, oh DW, come on, there has to be at least a few of the gems that just give you noticeably better stat improvements because they're higher tier. No, they actually all give basically the same levels of bonuses. The difference between the gems is extremely negligible. In fact, I've run into so many situations where I have found much higher tier gems that are just straight up inferior to the gems I found 2 hours before. And that's to say nothing of the fact that gems in and of themselves as a loot system are unbelievably boring. Why in the living hell would I get excited over a bunch of gems that just give me some very, very slight passive bonuses? And I do mean slight. You are not going to find any gems that give you anything more than maybe 20% of a bonus to something, and it's not going to be what you really want it to be. This all is compounded by the fact that there is an elemental system that is messing with the damage system in the game. You have 4 elements: ice, fire, electricity, and acid. And what type of elemental damage you do depends entirely on which gems you have slotted. What this basically meant in my case was I just slotted a bunch of different weapons with different elements, and I just swapped to which ones I needed at any given point, not because they were better weapons for the job, but because they were just the weapons that enemies were vulnerable to. Because you will run into that problem, where enemies will have various resistances. If they are superior or elite, then they tend to have some pretty severe resistances. In some cases, they are outright immune to certain kinds of damage. And I have no joke run into enemies that are immune to everything but a single type of damage. And if it were, say, a boss monster, then I could kinda understand that. It's not a boss monster, it's just superior and elite versions of monsters and enemies that you fight throughout the course of the game anyway. What do superior and elite mean? Well, basically they just mean that that particular enemy, even though it looks exactly the same as all the other enemies of that specific type that you fought before, has a massive amount more hit points and a lot of resistances that make them basically a bullet sponge. And you know what's really not fun in a first-person shooter? Bullet sponge enemies. It is not remotely enjoyable to sit there just wailing on enemies over and over and over again, basically exhausting all of your ammunition just to take a single enemy down. This is a considerably bigger problem toward the beginning of the game because you barely have enough ammunition to do what you need to do. Toward the middle and end of the game, it's still annoying as hell, but by that point you've found weapons that are capable of actually dishing out a lot of damage at once. Unless you run into enemies that are immune to physical damage, because I have run into those before. If they're immune to physical damage, it means that only your elemental damage is actually hurting them, and guess what? That's a fraction of the damage that your weapon does. Yes, the elemental gems do not convert all of your weapon's damage into elemental. No. They convert a portion of it, a percentage. And thus, in instances where an enemy is immune to physical damage, you're basically hitting them with the equivalent of a paper wad. It is immensely frustrating to deal with. And the problem is only exacerbated when you play it on a higher difficulty like I did. Because then the enemies do a lot more damage to you, and they're still bullet sponges. In fact, they're more bullet spongy than they were at lower difficulties. And the loot drops you get, while they're supposed to be quote-unquote better than what you get on lower difficulties, end up being still pretty much useless. But you know what's funny about the loot system anyway? You can actually pause the game at any time and swap out any of the gems in your weapons. It completely defeats the point of even having multiple weapons in the first place. If you've got one particular weapon that does a crap ton of damage no matter what you do to it, then you can always just pause the game, swap out the gems to make sure that they're the appropriate element for whatever it is you're fighting, and then once you've finished killing that, then you just pause the game, reslot it to whatever else is fighting you, and you just continue on your merry way. I mean, sure, you have a variety of weapons available, but why would you worry too much about that when you can just swap out the gems on whatever other weapon you're using that just dishes out the absolute most punishment? That is what inevitably will happen when you have a game that is ultimately focused on DPS. If you are only focused on how much damage you are dishing out at any given point, you're not going to give a crap about how the weapon feels, you're not going to give a crap about what its situational use is. You are only going to care about how much damage it does. This renders numerous weapons throughout the game effectively completely useless by the time that you get to the end of the game. There are certain weapons that you'll run across that just flat out do more damage than others, and you're just going to be like, well, screw it, I'm going to discard this old one and pick up this new one because it does more damage. And ultimately, a lot of that is just related to how much ammunition you have at any given point, so ultimately the combat system ends up just being a complete disaster. And it is entirely due to the fact that they put so much emphasis on the gems and the elemental attacks. It takes what was a really satisfying combat system in the previous Shadow Warrior game and just completely demolishes it. And as if that weren't enough, the side missions are almost mandatory. They're not quite mandatory. You can get through the game without completing them, but if you do that, then you miss out on skill points, you miss out on large amounts of money, and you miss out on special weapons that you can't necessarily get in the shop. So who in their right mind is going to avoid the side missions? Especially when certain story missions will give you a message saying, oh, this is a point of no return. If you have any side missions you haven't completed before this, then they will no longer be able to be completed after this mission. So you better go ahead and go do them first. And all that means is you're going to be saddled with missions that basically have you going to location, slaughtering everything in your path, and maybe coming back with an item or two. It is incredibly lazy design. I mean, hell, one of the missions was literally go to this location and find tea. Why? Because this lady Amiona really wants her tea, and she's some demon goddess, so it's something that she just has to have. So go ahead, Lo Wang, go get that tea, because that's something that you really need to do as a badass ninja. As I mentioned before, you are not doing these side missions because they're actually interesting. You are doing them purely because of the reward factor. You are doing them because it gives you a specific weapon that you can't necessarily get in the store. You are doing them because it gives you a large amount of money and skill points and such like that you can use to improve your abilities or buy things at the store like ammunition that is much needed or various gems or weapons or things like that. The side missions are completely worthless otherwise. And even the story missions are pretty much the same kind of thing, it's just that they actually have plot attached to them. The whole game just screams of following modern design trends instead of actually sticking to what made the previous game great to begin with. And that was really, really satisfying, fast-paced first-person shooter combat. What you have in Shadow Warrior 2 is a bunch of basically procedurally generated levels with a bunch of generic mobs that end up having a bunch of elemental resistances that you have to deal with. All of these enemies are bullet sponges except for the absolute weakest ones, which go down in maybe a couple of hits. And even when you factor in the elemental side of things, it just ends up being a matter of the game being completely self-defeating in its own game design. You have a co-op system that doesn't really do anything to mitigate the problems of the core game design and ultimately just ends up feeling completely tacked on. You have a story that doesn't really go anywhere. You have characters that really are not remotely impressive, and the only reason you're really amused by them is the fact that Kamiko and Lo Wang argue so well. And really all of the main positives are in the presentation side of things. Like I said, the game looks and sounds really good, but the gameplay just ultimately tears it apart. And ultimately, this is a game that is a prime example of how not to follow modern trends. Modern trends are not necessarily a good thing. Looter shooters are a fad. They're pretty much all going by the wayside at this point because looter shooters really are not very good games. Open-ended level design is really not necessarily a good thing unless it is built around that, and Shadow Warrior 2 is not built around open-ended level design. It's basically a tick box. And you have to keep in mind, Shadow Warrior 2 was one of my most anticipated titles for last year, and when you bring everything together with how the game actually is, it's a disaster. There were so many instances where I was trying to get through this thing for review where I was just going, what the hell were they thinking? And the ultimate consensus was, it's just a mind-numbingly tedious slog, like pretty much every other looter shooter on the market, in fact. To be perfectly honest with you, I had a really hard time deciding on the final summary for this particular review. On the one hand, it is definitely very functional as a piece of software. It has a lot of really cool stuff going on in the presentation, and that core gameplay is still there underneath all the garbage. But at the same time, the garbage ruins it so thoroughly that I was seriously wondering if I should go ahead and go with the lower score. Ultimately, I decided on giving it a 2 out of 5. Because like I said, that core gameplay is still underneath all of the crap, but it's almost impossible to get to it, and I cannot remotely recommend Shadow Warrior 2 as a result. If you're going to play a modern Shadow Warrior game, make it the previous one to this one. Make it the 2013 reboot, because that one is still rather good. But this one just misses the point entirely. Thanks for watching.